Hi, this is Dr. Scott Young, and today we're going to be on with SG Anon, and we're going to do this Post-NESARA series. What I really wanted for him to do is talk about after NESARA kind of hits in, so that actually presupposes an EBS, EAS kind of thing. When we have that situation, what does it feel like with the military? So we're presupposing some ideas. Remember, this is just trying to kind of get some ideas. Do we have the exact answer? Absolutely zero people in the world have that exact answer with that too. So let's just jump in here. So, hey, SG, how you been doing, man?
Doing well, Doc. Thanks for having me back. Good to be here.
All right. So again, everyone can find him on Rumble, and that's the site that you can kind of go and see some of that stuff. I'm going to send him over, the video that can be watched, on YouTube, or you can watch it on Rumble, whichever way you want to do that, and we'll kind of get that stuff set up with that too. Do you have any initial comments about anything that's happening in your life that you want to mention?
Well, I mean, probably not from the personal pulpit, but I would say that where we're at right now, Doc, is going to be pretty reminiscent of most patriots out there. People are starting to get a little war weary. That's expected towards the success of any military campaign. As a matter of fact, morale is often the lowest before significant battles or very significant movements that change the battlefield and change the landscape fundamentally. So we're at that period of time right now. We talked a little bit off air about how just yesterday the Biden White House extended the very national emergency under Executive Order 13848 that would ensnare them were we to see any sort of public or significant foreign interference in the United States electoral process. President Trump, just a few days ago, immediately prior to the extension of this order, put out a statement on Twitter and Truth Social that began with the words cease and desist. In other words, this was a threat. This was a warning from the president of the Constitution and the lawful commander-in-chief of the United States Patriotic Military Forces that cheating in the election process was going to be monitored, evaluated, cataloged, analyzed, and individuals that participated in that to any degree. As a matter of fact, the wording on the president's post was anyone who cheats for any reason would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So this is a shot across the bow to every level of that deep state component infrastructure. And now we have the teeth backing it up in the extension yet again of this national emergency.
Well, I find it so fascinating that, the left would even want to have this going on. I remember when this thing first came out, this little conversation here below says, although there's no evidence of foreign power, blah, 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 that actually, it wasn't in the original documentation for EO13848, but they added that little caveat in there. It's almost like two separate people writing this information, and so it's pretty darn chaotic when you look at it, because it's talking about, well, we need to have a national emergency for for potential of election fraud, but there is no fraud. It's like, no one in here cusses in this building, but over there they can cuss. I'm like, well, make it make sense. You know what I mean?
Well, it's very interesting because we saw President Trump issue this executive memorandum on the 12th of September, 2018. And this is the same person who on the campaign trail as early as January of 2016 was actively accusing Representative Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, of participating in election fraud. So this is, I find it very, very interesting that on the one hand, yes, we have almost a schizophrenic presentation of what's happening administratively through the document. And on the other hand, we know that the president who issued that document was fully aware of election fraud in the 2016 election cycle, the 2017 cycle in NATO nations, again in the 2018 cycle. And we've seen this national emergency sort of catalog and wrap everything together, if you will. Umbrella is maybe the best way to picture that. All of the election fraud activities ever since its enactment in 2018. What I think is very interesting is that it specifically states that there has been no evidence of a foreign power altering the outcomes or vote tabulations in any United States election. And yet it does not mention anything about domestic cooperation with a foreign power. And we understand fully that the Posse Comitatus Act, one of the things that it cannot be presented as is a law enforcement mechanism. That's outside of the bounds of the Constitution. But the Posse Comitatus can be utilized for militarized purposes. In other words, anti-terrorism operations, a military campaign or invasion of the United States of America that needs to be rebuffed by a militarized force, for example. These types of exceptions exist with the Posse Comitatus, but if we outlined the nature of what was happening domestically here in the United States through executive memorandum, we're making it by definition against the law, which means that we cannot utilize the military to address that emergency. This is very much a sleight of hand document in a lot of ways. I think it's a perfect example of irregular espionage warfare, and the fact that the Biden White House extended it on the 9th of September, which is the inverse of the number 66. I think it's poetic to no end.
Well, it's fascinating. I'd love you to kind of, the beginning section right here. I'll read it out loud because if you guys can't read it, I'll try to help you see it here with that too. It says Section 202, blah, 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 of the National Emergency Act provides for the automatic termination of national emergency unless within 90 days prior to the anniversary date of his declaration, the president publishes in the Federal Register and transmits to the Congress a notice stating that that the emergency is to continue in effect beyond its anniversary date. Can you make that make sense a little bit for people when they read that?
Well, essentially what it's saying is 50 U.S. Code 1622 will allow the president to operate in a period or an expanded authority state of national emergency here in the United States for, a period of 1 year. And we have to, within 90 days of that year deadline, we have to submit essentially reason to the Congress of the United States for why the president believes the national emergency should continue. One of the chief references to make with this particular process when we talk about national emergencies and their extension is Executive Order 13224, which was first issued on 9/23 of 2001 under George W. Bush and the 43rd administration, of course, in response to the events from 12 days prior. So 13224 was also extended several times by the Obama White House and the Trump White House. As a matter of fact, each year it was extended. One has to ask what the purpose of that extension may have been. And 13224 is an executive memorandum that essentially invalidates a significant component of habeas corpus here in the United States of America and allows for an expanded military authority under the guise of a militarized threat to the nation. It defines that militarized threat, of course, as terrorist operators, but it does not specifically list those terrorist operators as cataloged only associated with Islamic terrorism groups or African terrorism groups. It just describes terrorism in general. So when we look at the activities of the domestic judiciary, for example, here in the United States of America, not hearing cases of election fraud or outright ruling against provable election fraud and not allowing exculpatory evidence to come into the courtroom like we saw recently with Tina Peters or a number of others. When we look at the examples of the money laundering, which contributes directly to the weakening of U.S. national security and national defense. When we look at the foreign agents that are unregistered here in the United States of America, both lobbying our government and even in some cases participating directly in governmental functions, such as the Hunter Biden situation that was outed just a couple of years ago. We have to appreciate that terrorism becomes a very large umbrella. So when we look at the extension of national emergencies, whether it's 13848 or 13224 or 13952, or a number of these other orders that come into play with the period of time we're all living in, it is the fundamental need for them under an emergent basis that has been continued now for almost 23 years.
Right. So, I mean, then, and what I'm fascinated by when, I kind of was looking at the tie of 13848, which talks about the election issues. And when the original talks about the election issues, but it also ties in to domestic points and how that they were interacting with one another. It goes a lot deeper than obviously this does. Of course, the idiots want to do it their own way and pull away some possibility that domestically they could be doing anything. But it ties directly into the 14th Amendment under the third section, which talks about elections that they're messing with. So this is why this particular executive order goes, hey, listen, I'm looking at the amendments in the Constitution, and I'm following them clearly in here.
Well, fundamentally, I think that's exactly right. We had to take steps in alignment with the Constitution for the Republic to address the issues that were clearly outside of the bounds of the Constitution. You could even make the case in some regards, and it's sort of a nebulous argument, but articles and acts such as the Act of 1973, the 1973 War Powers Resolution, when we look at how that actually functions and the powers and authorities that it grants to the president, the executive, in a period of national emergency is really outside of the bounds of what the Constitution allows. The Constitution specifically dictates and allocates that it is the legislative branch, the people's branch, that decides to take the country into war or not. The president, as the commander-in-chief, does have to respond to national emergencies, but without the civilian assent to war, we just have essentially expanded law enforcement authority that's available to us. We don't have military authority. So the 1973 Act, which was utilized as the U.S. code basis for Executive Order 13224 that I referenced a moment ago, essentially invalidates that component part of the Constitution and allows the president to unilaterally declare a wartime national emergency and then utilize the full resources of the federal bureaucracy, all of which serve underneath the behest of the executive in the current format, to meet that particular emergency. And the federal bureaucracy, unfortunately, includes the Department of Defense. So when we look at that and we see how the corporate structure has tied very closely to the lawful civilian constitutional structure, but that there are minor tweaks and changes that allow things like that cascade domino effect to actually take place, we then have to bring everything to a close in the old system, in the old model. We have to arrive at a point where all of these national emergencies are fully dealt with, fully met, fully adjudicated, and can be released and ended. And then we move into, I think, a republic, a NESARA government, a new financial way of life. And quite frankly, I think the reemergence of the American Republic to the world. That process is not, instantaneous, as many of us out there are well aware by this point. It does take a little bit of time. But when we look at, President Trump's commentary just not that long ago about a 1929 style event, his commentary about utilizing Bitcoin to pay off the national debt, right? These types of things are sort of odes to the patriots out there that understand this is a much broader war. This is a much more long-reaching conflict. And at the end of the day, we'll see a resolution in our national debt system, a resolution in the debt enslavement model, and crypto and new physical currency and decentralization. All of these things are coming. They're not going away.
Right. Okay. So, let's transition into where we were, because we really got to deal with some of that stuff when it's on the table of this with that too. So our first kind of point that we talk about now, again, I want everyone to, I know everyone wants to ask questions about like, wait a second, but we're still in the war. I get it. But, most people realize who've studied war, and I know SG has, I've spent a lot of time on it in my life with this too. In the near endings of war, you start thinking about after it's done. What do things look like after it's done? Because you have to prepare. Now, there are times when you're not preparing because you're so deep in the war and you don't know if you're going to win or not. So you can't actually do that. But we need to talk in that preparation phase, the after phase. So in that kind of event, after an EAS, EBS, I like calling it EBS, it's just my little baby boomer kind of mentality. How visible on the streets do you think that the military might be?
I think we can expect to have a pretty pronounced and overt presence. There's an entity online that I take a lot of my inspiration from, and that entity describes that 80% of the operations to right the planet, and I'm utilizing that terminology sort of loosely, need to be covert just in order to allow the process to succeed at all. But 20% will be overt And this entity specifically addresses that in the context of public justice. In other words, people, going to prison, people paying for their crimes, bureaucracies, companies, things like that, actually being brought to heel by a law enforcement activity that is likely to include militarized anti-terrorism operations. So when we talk about the presence of the military on the streets, I think we really need to think back, for all of us out there, to 9/11/2001. What was going on that day and the immediate next couple of days after that? Well, obviously uncertainty, obviously confusion at a mass civilization scale. We saw interruption of communications. There was a great deal of fear, a great deal of wonderment. Now, if we take that landscape in the immediacy after that event and we marry that towards the idea of the U.S. military interceding on behalf of the people instead of against the people, which is what we saw that particular day with traders in the military helping to facilitate the actions that were taken by the civilian and intelligence institutions, then we would have seen a significant force deployment, certainly in New York City, certainly in all of the surrounding metros, likely in your major metros around the country: Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, Miami, very, very large metropolitan centers, potentially Denver. And so when we talk about how visible will the military be on the streets, how visible would the military have been in that day if it had gone down on behalf of we the people, I think that's a good place to start. My own personal opinion on this is that we're going to see National Guard forces responding to at least a number of different pockets of unrest, primarily in blue cities and states. We're already seeing preparation for that underway. We've seen rail car videos, submitted just over the last 12 months, at least on my end, showing tanks and Humvees and various armor being moved around the United States. And these are not simply to training operations. One of these videos that was submitted was from rural Idaho, and the individual in the video filming the video said that they never see anything like this coming through there. It's the first time they've seen it in 28 years. Right. So, looking at these types of things, the activity of military in Southern California, the activity of the military right now all up and down the eastern seaboard, the activity of military training forces, and I'm utilizing that with air quotes, in Central Texas, in North Texas, I think that we can expect some sort of public presence in response to this escalating event of terrorism that we've talked about. And why do we need to go that far? That's a question I get asked a whole lot. Why does it have to come to something like that? Because that's the scaffolding that these cretins set up. We're going to utilize their own playbook against them. We're going to just use that justification to tear down their whole diseased temple. But we are going to have to go through that, walking over the coals, if you want to call it that, in order to arrive at that other point. But I think when we arrive at that other point, Doc, we're going to have a very significant and pronounced, albeit maybe short-lived, military presence in the streets to restore law and order and take it away from foreign paramilitary forces, which is what these organized cartels and these organized mafias constitute. Right.
So in essence, and just to say it, in what you're talking about there, I've been having that vision for nearly 4 years, it might be more overt in Philadelphia, let's just say, that might have more unrest, whereas another smaller city like Oklahoma City that maybe doesn't have as much unrest issues, you just might see, the odd Humvee, or a couple dudes walking right by a Walgreens kind of thing. And you just go, that's kind of odd. Just noticing that they're moving in and out of different areas as just like police do. When police are there, people will slow down as they go through that particular, traffic area. And I think that's the same kind of idea.
I think so also. And the essence of the question really lies in how much resistance and how much obstruction and obfuscation is coming in any given locality. We can expect a lot more disturbance, for example, coming from the Twin Cities or Los Angeles or Denver than we could from, say, Jacksonville, Florida or Nashville, Tennessee. Right. I think a great deal of that is where are these terrorist cells and these foreign invaders going? We know that this has been happening across the southern border for the last 4 years right in front of us, but a lot of patriots forget that the process of infiltration goes back 3.5 decades. And we have significant organized cells that have had a long-term presence here, have established entire miniaturized, self-confined economies inside of our cities, inside of our states. And we have to disappoint and destroy those as well. So a lot of these activities, that the military, I think, is going to be undertaking to restore, civil rest and law and order and peace for the people. I think a lot of that's going to come down to intersecting those same very old networks and infrastructures, because those are the infrastructures that are funneling the people, funneling the children, funneling the drugs. They were primarily funded over a period of 4 decades from the U.S. State Department, the U.S. intelligence community, and various globalist NGOs. Most of us are sort of familiar with that overarching scheme now at this particular point in time. So how do we ensnare all of the above as militarized combatants against the United States of America? Well, we allow them to invade, and then we cause them to inaugurate some sort of an event. That event's likely to be much louder in Portland than it is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, for example, or much louder in Detroit than in central Indiana. So I think that's one of the reasons you've seen public figures talking about how the countryside is safe, the countryside is natural, there's more connection to the divine out in the country. You've seen certainly a mass exodus from the major cities and in the blue states over the last 4 years. Fundamentally, I think that's sort of poetry at the spiritual level, because what we're left with at the end of the day is the least amount of potential problematic damage possible that's left over in those states. When the time comes to intersect an actual militarized opponent, and that time is already beginning with what we're seeing in Denver, what we're seeing in Western Texas with the Tren de Aragua gang. We've got MS-13 in California, and people forget that these organized crime groups, especially in California, Chicago, and even along the eastern seaboard to some degree, they've controlled a lot of the local political actions on the ground in those communities for a very long time. So this is a fight that the last 4 years is giving us the flashpoint, if you want to call it that, the ability to actually ignite the entire pile of gunpowder. But I think from a patriot community standpoint, sometimes we forget that that pile of gunpowder has many, many barrels that have been added over many decades. It's not simply just, what we've poured in the last 48 months.
Right. So now I'm gonna have to preface this point here. It was my little stuttering there. If government is out, might the military have to step up and be that provisional government before elections are completed? So when I say government's out, if the government is out, what I'm meaning there is a great conversation that all of us have had in different ways, especially about the Brunson case. In essence, the Brunson case was a very strange case that comes up from Utah by the 4 Brunson brothers, and they keep popping in new facets of it. And even Lloyd Brunson was telling me directly, he goes, "Listen, I've never even seen anything like it. They would shoot down my case, and then my brother's case would pop back in, and then show up on the SCOTUS dockets, and then they would shoot that one down, and they would just keep bouncing them in. I mean, it's literally never happened in the history of the world. And basically, what it says is that from January 6th, which is the very important date, to January 16th, all they had to do is procedurally talk about election issues and talk over that fraud point. Once they did not do that, with Mike Pence and Langford and several of those other people that were active in not pursuing that role, every one of them, including all of the support staff, maybe 28,000-ish people, they're gone. Doesn't matter what the deal is, they're gone in that way with that too. So that's the backdrop of this conversation. So if government is out, might the military have to step up and be provisional governments, even down to local levels with that too?
It's a difficult question to ask, because we're starting to get into that legal scholar territory and what is and isn't allowed with the posse comitatus and DOJ guidance regarding militarized operations, etc. We know that governorships are typically utilized by military operations. Governor generals, for example, is an ancient term that goes back to that. To administer a territory when a territory is, primarily oriented in a foreign capacity and is not subject to civilian law enforcement and code.
Right.
I think it's very, very interesting, because one of the things we've sort of got going on right now is a dual government situation, with a provisional government being maintained by those combatant commanders out of the U.S. Pentagon going back as early as 2017, 2018. And yet at the same time, this entirety of the last 8 years, we have been painfully and painstakingly given a very normal, very business as usual presentation about the United States government, the machinations of the federal bureaucracy, the functions of governmental levers, and even in some regards, the functions of certain state governmental and provincial governmental permissions as it pertains to utilization of their own National Guard forces, for example, or utilization of components that they have tied back to the DoD. So my first inclination is to say they may not be willing as a militarized force to step out and take public provisional control. But I could very well see a trust fall style scenario being given here where the militarized forces of the nation catch the dead corporation, potentially after a cleaning of house from the Brunson case, or a financial event that just desecrates the government and forces the government to resign. And we could very well see the military make an announcement that states that they've been planning and expecting this for a while, that this is the last lawful record of government here in the United States, which may point us back to 2020 or even before that. And those individuals may be tasked to administer an interim government for a period of time. And we know, according to U.S. code, under extraordinary emergency conditions, if we have to remove a government, we have 120 days to basically hold a new election and to establish a new form and a new framework. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the same period of time referenced by the National Economic Security and Reformations Act when we're talking about the period of time to right the boat, to restore lawful authority, to end the national emergencies, right? So in a way, I guess my answer to your question, Doc, is sort of inadequate because it's both yes and yes in some regards. I think we're already there, but I don't think we'll see a public administration of our government in the form of, say, a junta or a military roundtable, even for a brief period. I think it's much more likely that we'll have an announcement made about the military undertaking anti-terrorism operations to protect the nation, and that they have appointed an interim government, and that interim government will essentially act as the lawful civilian authority in preparation for a new election.
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not going to be like the general is standing up in front. I mean, before that, that puppet mayor, in essence, that we might have all seen in movies that, you have a new mayor, for instance, like a Vichy France during World War II, where they were just puppets of the military in essence. That's not what he's saying here. What SG is kind of putting out there is that they might be working it together. You might still have a particular mayor that is not the problem and might be standing up in front, whereas necessarily other ones probably might not have that case because it'd be gone. So just another way of looking at that. Now, as we kind of move the conversation a little bit forward, because this is part of EBS. EBS, the emergency broadcast signal, EAS, the emergency action signal. So what happens in that particular thing is that we need to take over the mainstream media that is just the lying media that is not telling the people the truth. And when we see some of that stuff, you have to punish wrongdoing in essence, because every day you don't punish wrongdoing, it's exactly what we see in the streets of San Francisco. They put little signs up saying, you can steal up to $900 and we're not going to prosecute you in essence. I mean, little signs that I'm like looking at that going, you got to be kidding me. I mean, so if 80 people walk in and steal $500, you can wipe out a whole store. But you can't prosecute unless he goes to 950. I mean, and crazy stuff like that. But I think if you don't set that point based upon the oaths that they have actually given, then we don't have a rule of law in essence. And so that's why I think the military tribunal has to do. So what would you say about the military tribunal in that?
This is a fantastic question. I'm really glad you brought this up because we've had patriots in the last 6 to 8 weeks, again, with that war weariness, begin to doubt what they have seen right in front of their very eyes over the last 4 years. We have seen black bags rolled out of the White House. We have seen corral and internment operations under halogen spotlight at 11 p.m. at night on the White House lawn in January of 2021. We've seen a number of different shock and awe campaigns carried out through Marine Corps V-22 Ospreys and U.S. Army military helicopters on top of buildings in a number of different U.S. metro areas in the last 3 years. We know that these operations are occurring, that some amount of adjudication and justice is actively being dispensed with and doled out before our very eyes. But again, we come back to that 80%, 20% covert versus overt ratio that Q Online references and talks about. So it's not been but a few days ago now, I think coming up on maybe a week or two, that President Trump himself on the Truth Social profile that ties back to his personal profile put up a meme where the caption and content of the meme stated, "All roads lead to Obama. Read truth if you want to see televised military tribunals." So this is yet another example of President Trump reminding us.
Was that a couple days ago, or what was that?
This was August let me look here. August the 27th of 2024. President Trump shared this meme from Spiritual Street Fighter 17. That's the profile that was announced, that President Trump shared. So this is only 4 or 5 weeks after President Trump shared a starkly similar meme related to Elizabeth Lynn Cheney. That meme stated, "Elizabeth Lynn Cheney is guilty of treason. Read truth if you want televised military tribunals." As a matter of fact, both of these memes got such an attention online that the Associated Press ran a hit piece on the former one regarding Elizabeth Lynn Cheney, going back and discussing how President Trump was enabling QAnon conspiracy theories through his Truth Social profile online.
Yeah.
So, looking at that and understanding that, either the man is baiting us in the cruelest way imaginable, or we have a very exciting period of time coming here in America, because all roads will lead back to the shadow presidency of Barack Obama. All roads will eventually come back to the secret government that manipulated and worked in concert with that very shadow presidency to attempt an end-run coup around the lawful president of the United States, beginning as early as November of 2016, immediately after the election. So when we look at this, a military adjudication of the justice, as you highlighted a moment ago, some amount of punishment is going to have to come, because only justice can bring peace. And that's what people want to see. They want to see peace. They want a world that they don't have to worry about what's in their medication, what's behind the needle, what are they going to be required to do with their children, just so that they can participate in activities. What are we eating? What's in the food that we get in the drive-through line when we're rushed in an afternoon and we don't have time to be deliberate and organic and health conscious about the things we're consuming. People want to see a world that is balanced in common sense format. We don't need organic food coming out of every single orifice in society, but we certainly need poisons taken out of the food. We need to clean up our skies. We need to adjudicate the election fraud issue, which effectively neuters the most sacred right here in the United States of America, and that's the right to choose our government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You cannot have that if we have a situation where foreign actors in league with domestic accomplices and co-conspirators are disappointing the variability of determining what an accurate vote cast really is. And then we end up with a candidate that has merely been appointed by the same globalist donors who serve, 5-year representative terms in federal government, or they serve 20 years inside a corporation, and then rotate in and out of that same government apparatus. So I know that this is a long answer to the question, but I guess it's to highlight that I'm not insensitive out there, and I'm not unaware of what people are jonesing for. I'm jonesing for it myself, I'll be perfectly honest, but we do have to do it right. We do have to adjudicate it in the record. We can never allow this to happen again, which means we need precedent, we need scaffolding, we need teeth, we need literature that allows us to prevent this from ever happening again. And then we need public justice. And President Trump has told us not once but twice in the last 8 weeks that public justice would take the form of a televised military tribunal.
Perfect. That's perfect. Okay. So now there's a lot of conversations about this, and I'll set up my kind of point, and you can go wherever you want to on that. We don't always have to agree on things. By the way, the only time you really have to agree on something is if you're both playing a card game, okay? If you're not playing by the same rules, you're going to be in trouble and you're never going to get to the end of the game, okay? But it is okay for people to disagree upon some issues here. So when we talk about the EBS, EAS, how long might it last with the military? Now, I know some people will push toward it's going to be 6 to 8 weeks and, go on for a long, period of time. Some people will say it's 10 days because they've heard the really common phrase of 10 days of darkness. That was a big whiplash conversation. I remember talking with him back in 2020 before he was bounced off of Twitter, and really battering that particular conversation. And then we have people like actually Captain Kyle and I kind of lean a little bit more toward a 3-day kind of event. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to see, even if you have a shorter time frame versus a longer time frame, it doesn't mean that you don't have disclosure, but you would have the primary level of disclosure where you're, basically everyone is, looking through the lens, and that's all they're doing for that particular time frame. After that time frame, you will always, I don't care how long you did it for, you're still going to have to go back and talk about World War I, World War II. You're going to have to talk about, the military industrial complex. I mean, lots and lots of things that have to come up with that too. So that's one thing I would say. We should be closer to the lesser amount of time frame because, after 7 to 10 days of seeing, people being hung, and maybe that was your favorite, pop star and football, star to, the guy you voted for, people are going to be incredibly depressed in that way and having a lot of difficulties, psychologically with that too. So how would you land upon that particular topic?
I think the topic is a two-part question. How long are we going to have an emergency information distribution set up, and how long are we going to be unable to activate our electronics for other activities like, watching television or catching up on the weather or things like that? So I think with respect to what you said a moment ago, there's some inherent wisdom in a shorter time frame, if at all possible. We have 240 million gun-owning Americans here in the United States of America. The American population is extremely resolute and resilient and very patient and civilized, but under extreme emergency conditions and a great deal of uncertainty, you really you diminish a great deal of that patience and that civility component and capability quite a bit. At the same time, we do have to allow for a period that ensures everybody that has access to some sort of electronic device or a screen is able to understand at least the fundamental underpinning for why we are here. Q tells us online that the choice to know will be yours, which sort of implies that, there might be a feed playing online directly from certain courtrooms and certain chambers out there, but that feed may be publicly accessible and not required. In other words, it may not be forced upon you. I think with respect
to 1984, like 1984, big TV in front of you all the time thing. That's a good way of putting it.
Well, it just, the way you even characterize that, it sort of seems like it's in the wrong spirit, right? And we've tried to do things in the right spirit along in this journey as best as we can. There are things that we have to adjudicate. They're not pleasant. They'll never be pleasant, but the punishment needs to happen. People need to understand why we're here and how it's not acceptable as a human race to arrive at these points with one another. And yet at the same time, like you also said, we don't want to psychologically cripple, say, teenagers who happen to be out with their friends watching broadcasts like this, or individuals at home that are elderly and that maybe don't have the stomach, quite literally, to put up with those types of things. So I think it's very likely that we would have a 48 to 72 hour period of active emergency communications. In other words, letting people know what's happened, what's going on with the United States of America, what measures are being taken, and who the administrators for an interim civilian authority may actually end up being. And then it's likely we would see, for a period of at least a week or two beyond that, the option to tune in to continual public justice. You could call it public justice TV, for example. Now, again, that's just speculation on my end, and I want to highlight that for the audience, but it seems that we would have to marry the need for information, but also the need for, an appropriate amount of exposure, but not overexposure, all in the same egg. We would need to try and get that done in the same vein. And so a short period of letting people know what has brought us here and what's actually happening, followed by an extended period of optional tuning into the justice that a lot of these individuals may have already faced. I mean, there's nothing to say that we couldn't see analog replays of videos that are years old in that process streamed on that metaphorical public justice TV. It's also likely, though, that we would see community level officials, individuals who have been informed and apprised time and time again by civilian authorities, by patriots, by we the people in their communities, through formal documentation, formal acts and notices of service, formal requests to remedy the situation, and they've just completely ignored those. I would imagine that one of the reasons that we would have the option to know, the choice to know will be yours, is because a great deal of that will make us uncomfortable at the community level. There's a lot of community individuals who are aware that they have been participating in election fraud for a long time. There's a lot of community individuals that understand that they have taken oaths to foreign powers by enacting themselves through election process as occupiers of an elected office, and yet they're violating the title of nobility with the British accredited registry, for example. These are situations that are difficult, I think, to adjudicate in some regards, but we have to acknowledge that while we do have a lot of people at the community, county, and city level here in the United States that are, no more the wise, if we want to call it that, in other words, unaware of the criminality that they're actually facilitating, there are also a component of that same group that are fully aware of what they're doing, and they will be required to pay the price. So, in this period of time, I think that we would expect potentially even 3 or 4 weeks worth of the ability, again, to tune in optionally. This is not a small, crime syndicate to bring down publicly. And how much of that actually needs to be militarized, Dr. Scott, versus how much can be handled in a civilian court of law and the issuance of a life sentence, that's a difficult topic also to broach that may have to be broached in that same exact period.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we sort of talked about this. I mean, you're looking at from, just to sum what you said, 48 to 72 hours of a real intensive kind of, a very extreme kind of intense point, and then maybe a few weeks of it's over here on the side, but we can still go back to work in essence, in that way. And I find that very refreshing because I personally, and I would expand that a little bit because I believe that God has been preparing plenty of people. I know of at least 2 or 3, and I'm sure you do too, who've been prepared to kind of work on movies and TVs and actually whole production kinds of things about to explain to people, the initiation of the IRS or the Titanic in the real nature of what was happening to the Titanic, or any one of those areas, so that we understood what was really going on and some of the underpinnings for those, in essence, false flag events with that too. So you've sort of answered this. This is my next part of the question, but the population might sink into a depression. And I know a lot of people want to say it's going to be going on for several weeks. And I go, hold on. The economy can't be stopped for week upon week upon week. I don't care how much helicopter money you give. You can't stop an economy, stop small businesses to middle-sized businesses to large businesses, and then expect them to suddenly just pop right back up and not have the supply chains of moving around with that too. Does that make any sense to you, or how do you feel about it?
Well, this sort of ties back into the initial emergent conditions that we were talking about a moment ago. It's very likely that we would see either sort of coinciding with this or very nearly proximal to these events, some sort of economic event as well. And to your point, when we talk about the economy, we really saw the stress test of a century given to the economy in 2020, just 4 years ago. And we essentially proved that our economy can withstand about 28 days of hardcore being out of the limelight, so to speak. And beyond that, you start shuttering businesses completely. You start draining, life savings and finances. People just simply cannot refire the engine. The forge just gets too cold, to keep with the metaphor. So in this period of time, we have to consider that a changeover event of some kind has to take place. It's likely, based on the activities that we're seeing geopolitically worldwide in pretty steady format over the last 2 years, and really going back to as early as the first Trump administration, it's very likely that there's a setup or some sort of a catcher's net, if you want to call it that, that's being put into place for the collapse of the Western North American markets. But that collapse will need to coincide with an almost immediate refiring. And I would submit that that refiring really needs to happen inside of 15 to 21 days. So that would be about the same amount of time, again, that you could have some sort of ongoing, public justice TV broadcast in the background, while individuals out there that are engaged with the economy, especially business owners, are forced to reinvent their supply chains, or to adjudicate whatever inventories they have on hand, plan for the future. One of the beautiful things about this process is, because of the nature of the American free market system, we do have a significant amount of flexibility on how we can adapt to this situation as it sort of plays out before us. But fundamentally, we're talking about not only an adjudication of a national emergency happening publicly in this time, but we're also talking about the death of an entire economic model and the refiring of a new and better model inside the same scaffolding. It's sort of like taking the soul out of the beast and putting our soul back in. So in that period, I think you're looking at a maximum of 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks total, before irreparable harm is occurring. I think that you would need to see at least activities offered as solutions by an intermediary governmental apparatus, whether it's civilian or military in nature, that prevents a total collapse of the market system and the space. All of these events will reverberate essentially immediately into Western Europe. We have to keep that in mind. And a great deal of it has to coincide with the Chinese, Taiwanese campaigns, as well as the Korean campaigns in the Pacific region. And those campaigns could feasibly be finished inside of a 28-day mark, when you consider the ability of China, for example, to surround Taiwan, the ability of the Chinese and Korean navies, North Korean navies, to cause havoc with Pyongyang, or excuse me, with Seoul and South Korea, and shut down those arms dealer pathways as well. So we're working with, I hate to be redundant for the audience, but we're working with a multi-sided Rubik's Cube here, and all of the sides are being turned constantly, and we're simply trying to time it to where the sides are meeting together in all of their different angles at the same time, for a holistic picture of the cube before it continues to turn into the next phase.
Yeah, I mean, I think where you're going here is really powerful, and I would posit, though, that the patriots that are awakened, God's awakened you, and I would say you've got a purpose in here, and maybe you need to be listening for what that purpose might be, because you could be a really powerful cog in that. Maybe you can very easily go back to work and you can do the job. Whereas your unawakened colleagues around you are sitting in a corner just crying, and they can't even do the job. So that might be as simple as that. It might be more dramatic, that you're actually tabbed to say, hey, we'd like you to run for mayor, or whatever that might be with that too. Is that possible there, you think, or what do you feel like on that?
I think that's extremely possible, because you're talking about fundamentally decentralization happening as a result of need to restore, public law and order. And we know that once we have some sort of trust fall event, and it's likely to coincide with several other events proximally in time, we know that we're going to move back into a civilian authority, because that's the whole point of this, returning power back to we the people. So those who are most ready, those who are most adept, those who are able to stay cool under fire and understand how to manage the situation in their community, they will naturally rise to the occasion. Supply chains for local businesses, for example, that were once reliant on large international shipping lanes, may be able to be satisfied by the industry present within communities that are bordering one another. For example, in the community where I'm at, we have a very significant meat market, and that meat market gets a great deal of the product that it inventories and sells out to the public from international supply chains. But yet at the same time, just within this community and within, say, 40 miles outside of the county, there are no less than 14 different meat and livestock farms owned by families that are simply raising the animals because it's how they survive. It's how they make a living. So
Right.
if they were to step in and fill that gap, everybody wins. And I could see the same type of model being extrapolated in healthcare, for example,
Sure.
certainly in finance, as individuals that understand what has actually happened here bring their expertise to bear on how we make this work in our community. More than 40 states at this point have declared CBDCs to be illegal tender. So we
Yep.
know that we're already setting up an anti-centralization infrastructure for when these events take place. So those patriotic experts in those communities will rise up to the occasion, and they will be called upon to contribute in whatever way possible to refiring that situation that we were talking about. And remember, we're working with a time frame of about 21 to 28 days. Once you get beyond that, you start creating serious problems. So I could see a great deal of this, Dr. Scott, reorienting essentially overnight when you start removing the ability of large international corporations to control local supply chains, when
Right.
the regulatory industry that has killed all of the businesses is no longer functioning, when no one, when no one is at home, and we've managed to lock the doors, right? And when all the lights are off at the health department, for example, or the regulatory agency from the government that came in and fined you $800 because you didn't have the right faucet set up inside your bathroom, then we'll be able to see, I think, a really rapid transition into supportive capitalism with one another. And that is the essence of an asset-backed economic system in general.
Yeah, I mean, when you don't make, I mean, centralized government supports monopolies, and I would say this because I've watched this in my own industry, but I've seen this in quite a few different industries. For instance, in the defense industries, we had there was Martin. Then it went to Martin Marietta, and then Martin Marietta got bought out by Lockheed, and they moved together. And Boeing did the same kind of thing until all the little small private defense contractors were basically swallowed up. And what happens is that those big behemoths, they're very, very bad when it comes to competition. And yet, when you start to see them taken down, not because they're bad in and of themselves, but because that they have participated in the fraud events of everything we could talk about, you're going to see, a smaller, mid-size, maybe even a little bit larger size businesses filling that gap in the local and regional kind of areas. So that's kind of what you're saying there too.
It absolutely is. And it seems, on its face, it seems stupidly simple. And yet at the same time, it is the disappointment of the local enterprise, the local economy, the ability of all of us to manage our supply chain from point of sale all of the way back to raw origin point inside our localities that has contributed to the singularity of corporate enslavement throughout the economic sector. It's not just the fake dollar, but it's also the fact that all of our critical needs are consolidated under organizations that don't care a lick about what was going on with our communities and with our towns and with our villages and cities and things like that. They are concerned primarily with the bottom line and with whatever power that bottom line can buy them in government. So when we look at dropping that model and disappointing those larger entities, they're participating right now, right before our very eyes, in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and a literal invasion of the United States of America. So we know fundamentally that they are at the very least, going to end up restructured, probably fragmented and broken apart. And some of them will be, terminally removed from the planet, I think, for the participation in the secret intelligence community activities that really extend beyond the permissions of what the private sector allows. So when we look at, how this plays out, it sort of makes a lot of sense. And yet it's a little bit scary also, because we're being asked to rely on each other. We're not only trust falling into the arms of military forces, but economically, we're trust falling into each other's arms. If I need a chiropractor, for example, I'm not going out of town. I'm going to go to the neighbor next door because I won't have a choice. If I need to go and buy meat, I'm going up to the local butcher because that's what's closest to me, and that's what economically makes sense in my community. If I need candles, I'm going to find a candle maker where I'm at. If I need work done on my vehicle, I'm not going to go to a dealership, which is bought and paid for by a huge auto giant. I'm going to go to Jason's mechanic shop because he understands what's going on. So, looking at how this is really going to play out, a redefinition of our financial system has to include a decentralization to a huge degree of our economic activities and how we support one another in that capitalistic free market model. And I don't think you can even get back to that point until we go through that national emergency, that period that we referenced on our first half of the call today, sort of as the birth canal into that new world.
Right. And now I kind of popped this one in here because I guarantee it's going to come up in people's brains. So they're going, yeah, but I heard that all the power is going to be turned off. And I'm like, okay, first off, I'll just put a couple points out there. If you turn the power and the internet or both off, what happens is that hospitals cease to exist. I mean, people who are need to have injections and other kinds of things just to stay alive are going to die without power and without internet capability with that too. So do you want to jump into that one? This kind of thing, just power. So the power doesn't turn off, but maybe more of the social media and the mainstream media sources. Would that be effective or correct to say?
Honestly, I think it's likely that in this period of time, you would see some sort of attempt by the opposing side to turn our power out, to destroy the grid, to disappoint it, because fundamentally, if they can cause large-scale chaos prior to the actualization of some of these events from the patriotic perspective, then that sort of buys them more time on the game board. I think it's possible that we see localized power blackouts when some of these emergency conditions actually do come to fruition. But again, you talk about time frame. I don't think that you can get away with more than 36 hours. I mean, maybe a maximum of 48 hours without power connectivity before severe threat to life and limb starts to kick in. You have patients in hospitals that need medications, for example. You also need the ability to utilize power at home for medication preparation oftentimes, as well as other, management of other conditions that just simply need electricity to run the equipment that individuals have. At the same time, we're all pretty resilient. And so in accepting in the situation of immediate threat to life, we can probably deal with 36 hours of uncertainty, maybe 48 hours. We can get a couple of rough sleep nights in with the CPAP machine not working, for example, before we get into a real problem area. And it's much more likely, I think, that when we talk about blackout, we're going to see information blackouts. Simply because it is those social giants, those big tech Silicon Valley associated giants, and the MSM that are themselves implicated in extremely high levels of treason. And they will tell the lie all of the way to the end of the gate. They'll tell the lie as the house is burning down around us. And that's not something that we can manage going through a national emergency condition at scale if we don't also have an amplified voice of the alternative media. And I just don't see our opponents allowing the alternative sides, voices like mine and yours and others, to reach a large scale of the population when these events actually begin to kick off. So I could see a tete-a-tete happening in the information space where one side disappoints one side so the other side responds in kind. But with respect to the actual co-opting of the power grid, while I think that is a threat all through this period, I would be very surprised if we saw a mass scale blackout that lasted any longer than 24 to 36 hours.
Right. And I think that's a great point, because I think people have their anxieties pretty hard on this particular area. And I go, guys, listen, good game theory by military experts, and SG Anon understands this very well. Good game theory says, listen, we know that that's a possibility, and they probably have some other means of being able to bring that power back online. But frankly, if you don't have power, you're not going to hear, the EBS signal. You're not going to know. You're not going to be able to hear, that stuff coming over the internet, because a lot of people don't just have, over-the-air TV signals. A lot of people don't have anything but, their internet through social media kind of thing. So stop with the mentality of it's all going to shut down and then be replaced instantaneously. I think that's a little bit, that's kind of heavy fictional and scare tactic level.
Well, I think it demonstrates maybe a lacking understanding or an incomplete understanding of the game board that we're really dealing with. We're talking about amplifying to the greatest degree possible humanity's long-term survival chances and odds. And that's really what this boils down to. How do we preserve the greatest chance possible for not only humanity to survive this period, but to then take this period and thrive into the future and really turn this world into what it was supposed to be? So in that sense, allowing a significant mass panic event, any amount of time on the game board only works in favor of the deep state opponent and whatever remnant remains, right? Allowing any sort of, societal level chaos to persist longer than just what is absolutely necessary so that you can move swiftly about amongst the moving crowd, that's fundamentally going to disappoint your own aims. A good example of this is the January 6th false flag that we saw happen on January 6th of 2021. At the same time that event was occurring and you had a significant amount of distraction happening, we saw a number of laptops seized by coordinated plainclothes special operators who were in and out very quickly and who most people were no more the wiser about, including our opponents, because their own plan was literally backfiring for them in front of their face. So I'm looking at a similar tactic or a similar game board principle being applied throughout this entire process. And certainly here at this present time, we're coming into the conclusion of this phase. President Trump has told us that they're going to attempt to inaugurate some sort of terrorist event. So we could assume that an emergency alert action or some sort of pause on our national society would come as a result of that. We can also assume that utility providers will be extremely taxed in that period of time, and they may themselves choose to shutter because they're extensions of that deep state arm. And yet we also have alternative grids that have been built by the Army Corps of Engineers going through a number of states in the last 3 years. The ability of SpaceX to co-opt certain power systems from satellite orbit. And I guess I should reframe that. The ability of the DoD through SpaceX's technology and platforms to do that same exact goal. We have fallbacks and we have fail safes, right? But at the end of the day, what we have to do is manage to the greatest degree possible how these events play out. I think it's much more likely that they hit telecom over power, because when you start hitting, critical utilities, then that's really when you, as the deep state side or the opponent side, are acquiescing to the conclusion of the game. That's the point where you say, there's no way I'm going to win, so I'm going to just throw the game board off the table and be done with it. And at that point, we start to get into that justification for that intervention that we referenced at the beginning of our call. Fundamentally, I think it's very likely in this process that we see a reclamation of the power grid and of the utility structures as a result of military operations, but not necessarily a destruction of that grid purposefully enacted by the opponent, at least not entirely. It wouldn't surprise me if we see some of that in pockets, but I don't see that happening at mass scale.
Right. And so, for instance, the Obama movie, When I Leave the World Behind, I think that's last year or something like that, where basically the grid goes off. And then, so you've ripped off the power grid and you've ripped off, the internet capability. So that it doesn't help either side. It's the last desperate attempt. But when that happens, you lose too. And so I got to imagine that the military is looking at that saying, listen, we're going to, jump in before they get to that final desperate move. And you have to, that's an easy game theory point to kind of think on with that too. So as we kind of wrap up here, and I want you guys to go over and check out, him on Rumble, sign up, subscribe with that too. Do you have any other thoughts, that are happening? I'm sure a lot of people want to know, the feeling of, don't ask time frame, by the way, any of us, but the reality is no one knows that time frame. But do you have any other thoughts about, what might be around the corner?
We're still looking for the switcheroo, the change of batter. I think we've seen that from a soft position against Biden and Kamala, and we've seen the narrative prep really, painted to show Democrat infighting around that whole issue. But I still maintain that it's much more likely as we get closer to November that they take Kamala out also, because she's just so undesirable at a civilizational level, and you can't overcome that. And I think it's possible that they input Hillary as a potential replacement for that. Hillary's 2.0, double, the one that's about 8 inches shorter than the original. So, as we go through that, that's an event I'm really looking forward to, quite frankly, because I think that's going to just sort of fish upside the head, sort of, what is the terminology? I think it's slapped around the head with a wet fish kind of attitude. I think that's what's in store for the remainder of those really feminist progressive holdouts, right? I call them patriots in waiting, because they just haven't figured out who's telling the truth. But once they do, they become very exorbitant assets for our side. A lot of these people on the left have extraordinary levels of vitality and vigor. They could do a lot of good on the patriot community and for the patriot community if they had the proper context. So I think that's one of the things that we're expecting. I'm also expecting a major October surprise, or even a series of October surprises, to include potentially coming out of Russia with respect to Kiev. We've seen now a Belarusian troop buildup of about 12,000 just across the border there in Belarus. And the area that they're building up is only about 85 miles from Kiev itself. So this is a very immediate threat for that puppet regime in Ukraine. The Sergei Lavrov told us out of Russia's pulpit about a week and a half ago that negotiating with the Zelensky government is no longer an option. In other words, even if Zelensky says, I want to talk, they're not going to. They intend to come in and they intend to reclaim, I think, the whole of Ukraine, Kiev being one of those. So, this is just one, and I could spend 40 minutes, Dr. Scott, just talking about all of the events that we can expect in the next 8 weeks, and certainly in the 8 weeks following the November election timeframe. But fundamentally, it all boils down to a retransformation back to what the world was always balanced as before we started getting the tentacles and the claws of a very deep Luciferian occult about 2,000 years ago in the Western world, but going back a number of thousands of years. Once those claws started getting in our society, they shaped a world that is completely out of balance with each other. It's completely out of balance with God. It's completely out of balance with the principles of decency amongst human cultures the world over. And so this, for the first time, I think we're getting the opportunity to take that back. And given the gravity of that, I think we can expect our opponents to put anything and everything out onto the field, because they're not going to go quietly into that good night. But
sure,
this is a really exciting time to be alive. It's great to understand, I think, the history as it's being written, as it's happening. All of us essentially out there are war correspondents for World War III before World War III becomes more publicly overt and available for people to understand. But truly, it is the greatest time to be alive, and it's the greatest show on earth in many regards. It's not simply a show, but it certainly is driving a series of events here in the world that has showmanship at its basis, I think, in many regards. So I would tell patriots out there, hang tight. Hold on to faith and understand that your eyes have not lied to you, that Executive Order 13848 was not extended by the Biden White House. It was extended by a shadow government puppeteering the federal bureaucracy just yesterday, where they're tying their own noose before the world's eyes and before our eyes. It's very pleasant to see. And I think as we go through the other side of this, the discussions about what we do with the time that we now have, the assets and the capabilities that are now provided to us, the wealth that is returned to the people over a period of time, but returned nonetheless. Those are going to be the primary discussions. How do we change the world into what it was always supposed to be? And I think those are the types of talks that we really need to start having now.
Right. And I mean, there's another issue that's going on too. The federal budget for America does reset at the end of September. So October is a new fiscal year as well. So that's another potential point that is a time locked period right before, we get into the potential of an election season. But I would say one thing that I think you feel, and I know a lot of people who have a more balanced perspective. This isn't like we're walking into the millennial reign of Christ. I get lots and lots of people doing this as an eschatology guy, end time kind of thing. You don't have that, because we would be skipping over 650 scriptures that the word tells us about. But what I would say is that it's not going to be like this perfection, even 5 minutes after the EBS, or even after that initial time frame, it's not just going to be wonderful, it's going to be chaotic. And yet you're going to feel better every single day because you hit the bottom of that rung and you have the ability to walk through it instead of feeling so out of control with it too. So I appreciate you coming on and really love what you're doing. And, guys, I would really ask that you be in prayer for the both of us, as well as other patriots that you know of, because you have no idea how much negativity comes toward us and how many attacks that we get. So just keep us in prayer. That's really, really important. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate that a bunch.
Amen, Dr. Scott. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to coming back. Everyone stay safe.
Okay, thanks.